For the sixth time in as many years, no invitation arrived for the winter holidays, and so Helen Garrison made a decision that would alter everything. She purchased a secluded property in the Cascade foothills, a place entirely her own. 7 days after closing on the house, her adult children appeared on her new doorstep, clutching a duplicate key they had obtained through deceit, certain they would find her isolated and grateful for their sudden attention. They could not have anticipated what awaited them inside. A uniformed officer of the law, multiple recording devices capturing every angle of the property, and an attorney prepared to document their uninvited intrusion. The revelation of their scheme was never supposed to reach Helen's awareness. The conversation that should have remained hidden from her occurred quite by accident during a video call with her youngest grandson. Tyler was only 9 years old, and his face filled the tablet screen with the unguarded honesty that children possess before they learn the art of careful omission. His forehead wrinkled with genuine confusion as he asked the question that would crack open the careful facade his parents had constructed. "Grandma Helen," he began, his voice carrying the weight of a mystery he could not solve, "why aren't you coming to our house for the holidays this year? Are you going somewhere else instead? Somewhere fun?" Helen kept her expression neutral despite the cold sensation spreading through her chest. "What makes you think I'm not coming, sweetheart?" she asked, though she already sensed the answer taking shape. "Dad told me you're busy," Tyler explained, his 9-year-old logic struggling to make sense of adult evasions. "He said you have other plans, but I want you to come. We're going to have so much fun, and Mom's been planning for weeks. She has this whole folder on her computer with lists and everything. It says Holiday Gathering 2024 on it, and there are so many names." The words landed with precision. "Is my name on any of those lists, Tyler?" Before he could respond, a manicured hand entered the frame and extracted the tablet from the boy's grip. Amanda's perfectly composed face replaced her son's, her expression shifting through several calculations in the space of a heartbeat. "Tyler," she said with manufactured patience, "you know the rules about screen time without permission." She finally seemed to register Helen's presence on the call. "Oh, Helen, I'm sorry about that. He's testing boundaries this week. You know how children are at this age." Helen measured her words carefully, a skill honed across decades of managing university classrooms and faculty politics. "Amanda, Tyler mentioned something about holiday plans at your house. It sounds like you're hosting quite a gathering." Amanda's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at the corners. "Oh, well, nothing's finalized yet. We're still working through the details. Everything's quite tentative at this stage." "I see," Helen replied, maintaining an expression of polite interest that revealed nothing of the hurt crystallizing beneath her sternum. "Well, when those details do become final, I would appreciate being informed. I'd love to see the grandchildren over the holidays." "Of course," Amanda said quickly. "I really should go now. Tyler has homework, and I need to start dinner. Say goodbye to Grandma, Tyler." Helen heard Tyler's muffled farewell before the connection terminated, leaving her staring at her own reflection in the darkened screen. She sat motionless in the living room of the house she had shared with Robert for 43 years, the house where they had raised 3 children and hosted countless celebrations. The silence pressed against her ears with an almost physical weight. This would mark the 6th consecutive year, 6 winters since Robert's death, 6 holiday seasons of increasingly transparent excuses delivered with decreasing sincerity. "We're keeping the gathering intimate this year, Helen. The children were exposed to something at school. We can't risk your health." "Oh, didn't Stephen mention it? We changed everything at the last moment due to scheduling conflicts." The excuses varied in their specifics, but carried the same essential message. Her presence was unnecessary, her absence convenient. Helen rose from the sofa and walked through rooms that felt more like a museum with each passing month. Photographs lined the walls and mantels, documenting decades of family life that now seemed to belong to someone else entirely. Robert smiled at her from a dozen frames, frozen in moments of joy that felt increasingly distant. She paused before their wedding portrait, studying the young woman in the photograph who could not have imagined this particular loneliness. Something inside Helen, a structure that had been bending and accommodating for 6 years, finally reached its breaking point. The sensation was almost audible, an internal snap that left her feeling lighter and more resolved than she had in years. She walked to her study and opened her laptop, navigating with deliberate purpose to her banking portal. The balance displayed on the screen still had the power to surprise her. Even months after Robert's death had required her to fully understand their financial position. Robert had been brilliant with investments, moving money strategically throughout their marriage while they lived with deliberate modesty. There was also her family inheritance, which had grown substantially under Robert's careful management. Her children had no conception of these resources, largely because Helen and Robert had chosen to prioritize experiences and education over displays of wealth. Her children assumed the pension from her university teaching career represented the entirety of her means. They believed her to be, if not poor, then certainly constrained, which made their neglect even more difficult to rationalize. They excluded her despite thinking she had little, not because they resented her wealth. Helen's finger hovered over the trackpad for only a moment before she clicked through to a real estate website she had been browsing with increasing frequency over the past several months. What had begun as idle fantasy, a way to imagine different possibilities for her remaining years, suddenly crystallized into concrete intention. She had been studying properties in the Cascade foothills, drawn to the combination of natural beauty and protective isolation. 3 hours later, she had scheduled a viewing for the following morning. The property she selected was a contemporary design with sweeping windows that captured mountain vistas, perched on 7 wooded acres that promised complete privacy. The listing price of $1.4 million would render her children speechless, she thought with grim satisfaction. The real estate agent, a woman named Patricia who projected professional skepticism, met Helen at the property the next afternoon. The agent's gaze traveled from Helen's sensible walking shoes to her understated wool coat, clearly attempting to calibrate whether this appointment represented a serious inquiry or a waste of time. "This is a significant investment," Patricia began carefully as they approached the entrance. "Most of our clients in this price range are families looking for vacation properties or couples planning for retirement together." "I'm neither of those things," Helen replied evenly. "Does that present a problem?" As they moved through the house, Helen felt something settle in her chest that she recognized as rightness. The main living area featured floor-to-ceiling windows that framed the mountains with almost cinematic grandeur. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its massive hearth speaking of winter evenings and crackling fires. The kitchen offered professional-grade appliances and abundant counter space, perfect for the complex recipes Helen had been collecting, but never attempting because Stephen claimed to dislike adventurous cuisine. The previous owners installed a comprehensive security system, Patricia mentioned as they toured the primary bedroom suite. Very high-end components, cameras with excellent night vision, motion detection, professional monitoring capability. The subscription would need reactivation, of course, but all the infrastructure is already in place. Helen nodded, already envisioning herself here, safe and autonomous in a space no one could enter without her explicit permission. "That's excellent," she said. "I'll take it." Patricia blinked rapidly, her professional composure fracturing. "Don't you want to consider it further? Perhaps discuss it with family members, get a home inspection." "I've been considering it for months," Helen replied truthfully. "And my family has no role in my financial decisions. I can make a substantial cash offer, which should expedite matters considerably." 2.5 weeks later, Helen signed the final documents and received the keys to what she had begun thinking of as her mountain sanctuary. The transaction had moved with remarkable speed, thanks to her ability to avoid mortgage complications. As she drove up the winding private road on a grey December afternoon, snowflakes began to drift down through the evergreens, dusting the landscape with the first coating of winter. Inside her new home, Helen walked from room to room with her fingertips trailing along walls and countertops that belonged to her alone. No memories haunted these spaces, no disappointed expectations lingered in the corners, no ghosts of better times whispered from the shadows. This was purely forward-looking, a declaration of independence from the narratives others had written for her life. She activated the security system immediately, following the instructions to set up the mobile application that would allow her to monitor the property from anywhere. The cameras positioned around the perimeter blinked to life, their feeds appearing on her phone screen in a grid of different angles. Satisfied with the setup, she called the one person who had remained consistently present through everything since Robert's death. "Thomas?" she said when he answered. "It's Helen. I've done something that's either remarkably brave or spectacularly foolish, and I could use some legal perspective on establishing residency and updating my estate documents." Thomas Caldwell had been Robert's closest friend since their graduate school days, a friendship that had endured across 4 decades. After Robert's death, Thomas had become Helen's most reliable support, offering both legal expertise and genuine friendship without expectation or judgment. His initial surprise at her announcement gave way quickly to wholehearted approval. "It's about damn time you did something entirely for yourself," he said warmly, his voice carrying both affection and respect. "I'll drive up this weekend to help you get settled properly. We'll review all the documentation and make certain everything is legally sound." As Helen ended the call, she stood before the wall of windows and watched snow begin to accumulate on the mountain slopes. For the first time in 6 years, she found herself anticipating the holidays with something other than dread. This would be a celebration entirely on her own terms. The first week in her new home passed in a blur of deliveries and decisions. Helen had transported only personal items from her old house: photographs, books, her mother's china, Robert's collection of jazz recordings. Everything else she purchased new, furnishing this space to reflect her current self rather than accommodating the preferences of a deceased husband or absent children. Each choice felt like a small declaration of independence. The sleek, sectional sofa in charcoal grey, the adjustable bed with its sophisticated control system, the abstract artwork that spoke to her aesthetic rather than matching some imagined family consensus. "You're building a nest," Thomas observed when he arrived Friday evening, snowflakes melting in his silver hair. His arms were laden with an overnight bag and a bottle of champagne that looked expensive. He surveyed the living area with obvious approval, taking in the mountain view through the windows and the careful arrangement of furniture that prioritized comfort and sightlines. "Is that what this is?" Helen laughed, accepting the champagne. "I thought I was having a late-life crisis." "A crisis involves poor decision-making and regret," Thomas countered, setting down his bag. "This is possibly the most sensible thing you've done in years. The view alone justifies the investment, never mind the psychological benefits." After showing Thomas to the guest room, Helen gave him the complete tour, ending in the home office where she had set up the security system's monitoring station. Multiple screens displayed feeds from cameras positioned at every entrance and along the property perimeter, creating a comprehensive surveillance network. "Quite the command center," Thomas remarked, one eyebrow rising. "Are you expecting trouble?" "Just being practical," Helen replied, though she did not mention the nagging anxiety that her children might not respect her boundaries once they discovered this new home. Some instinct told her to keep that concern private for now. I'm a woman living alone in a relatively isolated location. It seems prudent to have awareness of my surroundings. Over dinner, a bouillabaisse Helen had always wanted to attempt, but never had because Stephen's professed hatred of seafood had made it impractical. Thomas helped her work through the practical implications of her new life. They discussed updating her will, officially changing her residence for tax and legal purposes, and notifying various institutions of her new address. "What about the old house?" Thomas asked, refilling their wine glasses with a crisp Sancerre that paired beautifully with the seafood. "Have you made any decisions about that property?" "I'm considering selling it," Helen admitted, tracing the rim of her glass with one finger. "There's nothing keeping me there anymore. The neighborhood has changed, and the house is far too large for one person. More importantly, every room contains memories that feel more painful than comforting these days." Thomas's expression grew serious. "Have you told your children about any of this? The new house, the potential sale, any of it?" "Not yet," Helen said, avoiding his gaze. "They haven't called, not even to discuss holiday plans that apparently don't include me yet again." Thomas's jaw tightened visibly. He had witnessed Helen's increasing isolation over the past 6 years, had seen how her children's visits became shorter and less frequent, how they forgot to include her in family gatherings while simultaneously making pointed comments about her modest lifestyle, and suggesting she should consider senior living communities for her own safety. "They inherited their father's worst traits," Thomas said quietly. "Robert was brilliant and driven, but he could also be controlling and status-conscious. You balance those tendencies during the marriage, but without your influence those qualities have flourished unchecked in your children. I keep wondering what I did wrong," Helen confessed, the wine loosening her usual reserve. "Was I too indulgent, too critical? Did I fail to teach them basic empathy and consideration?" "You didn't fail, Helen," Thomas said firmly, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Some people make selfish choices, even when raised with better values. The question now is what kind of relationship you want with them going forward, assuming you want one at all." Helen considered this as they moved to the comfortable sectional with their wine, the fireplace casting dancing shadows across the room, while snow fell steadily beyond the windows. "I want a relationship based on mutual respect," she said finally. "Not obligation, not pity, and certainly not convenience when it happens to suit their schedules. I want them to see me as a complete person with agency and desires of my own, not as a supporting character in their lives who exists only to provide childcare or validation." Thomas nodded thoughtfully. "Then perhaps this house is the perfect opportunity to reset those expectations completely. You've created a physical space that represents your independence. Now you need to establish the interpersonal boundaries to match." The next morning brought heavy snow and an unexpected visitor. Helen was arranging newly delivered books on the built-in shelves when the security system chimed, alerting her to movement at the front entrance. On the monitor, she saw a man in his early 40s wearing a heavy jacket and a knit cap bearing a police department insignia. He carried a wicker basket and was looking directly at the doorbell camera. "Good morning," he said when she activated the two-way audio. "I'm Patrick Morrison, your neighbor from about half a mile down the road. Thought I'd welcome you to the mountain properly." Helen hesitated only briefly before responding through the intercom. "That's very thoughtful. I'll be right there." Patrick Morrison stood well over 6 feet tall, with the broad shoulders and weathered face of someone who spent considerable time outdoors. Despite his imposing physical presence, his smile was gentle as he handed Helen the basket. "Homemade sourdough bread, local honey from a beekeeper about 2 miles south, and a decent bottle of whiskey," he explained. "Mountain essentials in my experience." "That's incredibly kind of you," Helen said, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Would you like to come in for coffee? I just made a fresh pot." Over steaming mugs at her kitchen island, Helen learned that Patrick was a police officer currently on medical leave while recovering from a shoulder injury sustained during a domestic violence call. He lived year-round in a timber-frame cabin about half a mile down the mountain road, a property he had built himself over the course of 3 years. "Not many full-time residents up here," he noted, glancing appreciatively around Helen's kitchen. "Most properties are weekend retreats for city people who rarely bother to introduce themselves to their neighbors. Half the houses sit empty 11 months of the year. I'm planning to live here permanently," Helen explained, surprising herself with how natural those words felt. "I recently retired from teaching, and I wanted a fresh start in a place with no history attached to it." "On your own?" Patrick asked, then immediately backpedaled. "Sorry, that's none of my business. I didn't mean to pry." "It's fine," Helen assured him. "Yes, I'm on my own. My husband passed away 6 years ago, and my children have their own lives and families to manage. This felt like the right time to prioritize what I wanted, rather than waiting for others to include me in their plans." Patrick nodded, seeming to understand what she was not saying. "Well, mountain neighbors look out for each other, especially during winter. I'm just down the road if you ever need anything. Snow removal, generator advice, or just company during a storm." He pulled out his phone and read off his number, which Helen entered into her contacts. "Cell service can be unreliable during heavy weather, but I've got a landline that never fails. And I'm usually home these days while this shoulder heals." After Patrick left, Helen stood at the window watching him navigate the snowy path back to the road. There was something reassuring about knowing someone capable and kind lived nearby, someone who had also chosen this particular form of solitude, but remained open to neighborly connection. That evening, as Thomas prepared to return to the city, he noticed Patrick's number saved in Helen's phone. "Making friends already?" he asked with a teasing smile. "Should I be jealous that you've replaced me as your emergency contact so quickly?" "Don't be ridiculous," Helen laughed, swatting his arm playfully. "He's young enough to be my son, and he's simply being a good neighbor. It's nice to know someone reliable is nearby." "Young enough to be your son and far more attentive than your actual son," Thomas observed pointedly, "which tells you something about priorities." As they hugged goodbye at the door, Thomas held her a moment longer than usual. "I'm proud of you, Helen," he said quietly. "This is your second act. Make it everything you want it to be, without apology or compromise." Watching his taillights disappear down the snowy road, Helen felt a curious lightness in her chest. For the first time in decades, her life was entirely her own to shape. 2.5 weeks passed in peaceful routine. Helen established patterns that pleased no one but herself. Morning yoga facing the mountains, afternoons reading by the fireplace, evenings experimenting with challenging recipes she had always wanted to master. She spoke with Thomas every few days and exchanged friendly waves with Patrick when their paths crossed on the private road they shared. She'd almost forgotten about the holidays until her phone rang on the afternoon of December 19th. Stephen's name appeared on the screen, her first contact from any of her children since moving to the mountain. "Mom," he said when she answered, his voice carrying that familiar note of forced patience that made her jaw tighten. "Where have you been? I've tried calling the house multiple times this week, and there's never any answer." "Hello, Stephen," Helen replied, deliberately not explaining her whereabouts immediately. "I'm fine, thank you for asking. How are Amanda and the children?" "We're all fine," he said impatiently, clearly uninterested in pleasantries. "But seriously, where are you? I drove by the house yesterday and it was completely dark. Your car wasn't in the driveway." The revelation that he had been checking up on her, not out of concern, but apparently to confirm something, sent a chill through Helen. "I've moved," she said simply. A beat of silence. Moved? He repeated, as if the word were unfamiliar. Moved where? You didn't mention anything about moving. Why wouldn't you tell us something that significant? I wasn't aware I needed permission or approval for my living arrangements, Helen replied, her tone sharper than she had intended. Years of suppressed hurt were finding their voice, and she made no effort to soften it. Of course you don't need permission, Stephen backpedaled quickly, his salesman's instincts engaging. It's just surprising, that's all. Where are you living now? Some kind of senior community? There are some nice places near us that we could help you research if you're looking for something. The assumption stung deeply. No, Stephen, I haven't moved to a senior community. I've purchased a house in the Cascade foothills, a rather substantial property, actually. The silence that followed was more profound this time. You've what? He finally managed, his voice rising slightly. Mum, how could you possibly afford something like that? Your pension can't cover a mountain property. The maintenance alone on those places is astronomical, never mind the isolation and practical challenges. Your father and I were always prudent with money, Helen replied, deliberately vague. We made sound investments over the years. I'm perfectly comfortable financially, thank you for your concern. But mountain properties can be incredibly expensive, Stephen continued, clearly trying to recalculate his understanding of her financial situation. And living alone in an isolated area at your age seems risky. What if something happens? What if you fall or have a medical emergency? I have a security system, reliable neighbors, and my phone, Helen said calmly. I'm 63 years old, Stephen, not 90. I'm perfectly capable of living independently in whatever location I choose. Another pause. Right, of course, he said, though his tone suggested he was still processing. Actually, the reason I was calling. We've been trying to finalize plans for the holidays. Jennifer and Brian are bringing their families to our house for the festivities. Then we're all thinking about taking a short trip somewhere with snow for the children. The perfect opening lay before her, yet Stephen still was not extending an invitation. 6 years of exclusion had made it automatic, a pattern so ingrained he did not even recognize the omission. That sounds lovely, Helen said neutrally. I hope you all enjoy yourselves very much. Right. Well, Stephen cleared his throat. You'll be all right on your own for the holidays then? Do you have plans? I'm planning something special for myself this year, Helen said truthfully. Something quite different from previous years. After ending the call, Helen sat watching snowflakes drift past the windows. An uneasiness settled over her that she could not quite articulate. The conversation felt like reconnaissance, Stephen confirming she had no expectations of inclusion before finalizing their plans. Her suspicions were confirmed 2 days later. The security system alerted her to a vehicle approaching in mid-morning. Through the kitchen window, Helen recognized Stephen's luxury SUV creeping up her driveway, moving slowly, as if the driver was uncertain of the destination, or perhaps taking in the details of the property. The vehicle stopped about halfway up the drive, and Stephen emerged from the driver's seat, looking up at the house with an expression Helen could only describe as disbelief. From her position inside, Helen watched her son walk slowly forward several paces, his gaze traveling from the contemporary architecture to the mountain vistas beyond, clearly photographing the house with his phone from multiple angles. He took at least a dozen photos, occasionally zooming in or changing position to capture different perspectives. After approximately 5 minutes of this, he returned to his vehicle and drove away without ever approaching the door or attempting to make contact. Helen immediately called Thomas. He didn't knock, she explained, reviewing the security footage on her laptop while Thomas listened. He didn't ring the doorbell. He just drove up, took photographs, and left. How did he even find my address? I haven't shared it with any of my children yet. That's concerning, Thomas said, his attorney's caution evident in his tone. Property records can be searched online, But your purchase wouldn't have been fully processed and posted yet. Did you mention the specific location to anyone who might have passed it along? No, Helen said firmly. I've been deliberately vague about the details. Only you and Patrick know the actual address. Then we need to find out how he located you, Thomas said. In the meantime, I'd suggest reviewing your security footage carefully. If he's been by once, he may return. Helen spent the next hour examining the security system's recordings from the past week, searching for any earlier visits she might have missed. She found nothing, which meant Stephen's visit that morning had been his first successful attempt to locate her new home. But how had he managed it? The answer arrived the next morning in a flurry of text messages from all three of her children, the most communication she had received from them in months. From Stephen, "Mom, we need to talk about this house situation. Call me ASAP." From Jennifer, "Since when do you have money for a vacation home? We need to discuss this as a family." From Brian, "Are you sure this purchase was wise at your age? Living alone in the mountains seems incredibly risky." Helen responded to none of them, choosing instead to drive into the nearest town for groceries and to complete some final preparations for the holidays. She had decided to host a small dinner on the evening before the holiday itself, just herself, Thomas and Patrick, who had mentioned having no family in the region. When she returned home that afternoon, her arms laden with grocery bags and packages, something felt immediately wrong. The security system showed no alerts on her phone, but there was a subtle difference in the entryway that caught her attention. The bench near the door sat at a slightly different angle than she remembered, and the mat in front of the coat closet was askew. Helen set down her bags carefully and pulled out her phone, opening the security application to review the footage from the past few hours. What she saw made her blood run cold. At 2:47 in the afternoon, a car she recognized as Jennifer's sedan had pulled into her driveway. The exterior camera captured Jennifer and Brian approaching her front door, looking around almost furtively before Jennifer reached into her purse. She extracted what appeared to be a key, and after a moment's fumbling with the lock, the door swung open. The interior cameras showed Helen's daughter and son entering her home without permission, wandering through every room with a combination of curiosity and entitlement that made Helen's hands shake as she watched. They opened closets, examined furniture, studied the view from various windows, and even opened her refrigerator to peer inside. Brian helped himself to a bottle of water without hesitation. The audio captured their conversation with perfect clarity. "This place must have cost at least $1 million, Jennifer said, running her hand along the kitchen island's marble surface. "Maybe more, given the location and square footage. Where the hell did she get that kind of money?" "Dad must have had investments we didn't know about," Brian replied, wandering into the living room. "There's no way she could afford this on a teacher's pension. Even a full professor's salary wouldn't cover something like this." Jennifer joined him at the windows. "This location is prime real estate," she observed. "The privacy, the views, the acreage. Think about the family gatherings we could host here. So much better than her old house, and certainly better than Stephen's place. The kids would love it up here. Stephen's already making plans," Brian said, returning to the kitchen to examine the high-end appliances. "We're all coming up for the holidays. Surprise her with a big family Christmas. It'll be perfect." Jennifer laughed, a sound without genuine humor, as if this is somehow still her decision to make. She said, "It's family property now, whether she realizes it or not." They spent 40 minutes inside Helen's home, poking through her belongings with a casualness that suggested they felt entitled to access every aspect of her private life. Before leaving, Jennifer placed something on the kitchen counter, a key, which she pointed to while saying something to Brian about making certain everyone had access to the property. Helen checked her front door after watching the footage. It was locked, meaning Jennifer and Brian had relocked it when they left. If Helen had not reviewed the security footage, she might never have known about their invasion of her privacy. Fighting a rising sense of violation and anger, Helen called Thomas, then Patrick. Within 30 minutes, both men were standing in her kitchen, reviewing the security footage with professional focus. They had a key, Helen said, her voice steadier than she felt. Jennifer used a key to enter my house without any permission whatsoever. The only way they could have obtained a key is if someone involved in the real estate transaction provided it to them, which would be highly unethical at minimum, possibly illegal. Thomas's expression had gone cold and professional. This is definitely something we need to address legally, he said. I'll contact Patricia immediately to find out how this happened. Patrick, still in his police uniform from an earlier shift, studied the security footage with tactical attention to detail. This is textbook criminal trespass, he confirmed. Having a key doesn't grant legal permission to enter someone's home without the owner's consent or knowledge. The fact that they discussed their intentions to return and specifically mentioned surprising you makes this premeditated. Helen took a deep breath, steadying herself against the kitchen counter. They're planning to come here for the holidays, she said, all of them. Stephen mentioned something about surprising me with a big family Christmas. They think they're just going to show up and take over my home for days. Patrick and Thomas exchanged a look that Helen could not quite interpret. What did you have in mind? Thomas asked carefully. How do you want to handle this when they arrive? I want them to understand they cannot simply invade my life whenever it suits them, Helen replied, a lifetime of accommodation giving way to righteous anger. I want them to face actual consequences for their actions, perhaps for the first time in their adult lives. We can make that happen, Patrick said, leaning against the counter. The element of surprise should be yours, not theirs. They think you're going to be here alone, grateful for their attention. Instead, they'll find a very different reception. Exactly, Helen said, pacing her kitchen as ideas formed rapidly. They think they're surprising me, but we'll be waiting for them. Thomas pulled out his phone and began taking notes. Let's consider the practical aspects first, he said, his legal mind already organizing the approach. When do you think they'll actually arrive? The evening before the holiday seems most likely, Helen reasoned, based on what Jennifer said in the footage about Stephen's plans. That gives us 4 days to prepare. First priority is securing the property completely, Patrick said. I recommend changing all the locks immediately, today if possible. That key Jennifer used becomes worthless, and if they try to use it, we'll have additional evidence of attempted unauthorized entry. I agree completely, Thomas added. We also need to document exactly how they obtained that key in the first place. Patricia needs to answer some serious questions about her office's procedures. The next morning, Helen called Patricia directly, explaining the situation as diplomatically as possible while making clear the severity of what had occurred. Mrs. Garrison, Patricia replied, and Helen could hear genuine distress in the agent's voice. I'm absolutely horrified by what you're describing. I can assure you that no one from our agency would intentionally provide keys to anyone without your explicit authorization. Let me investigate immediately and call you back. When Patricia returned the call within 90 minutes, her voice was tight with professional embarrassment and anger. I've discovered what happened, she said. Your son Stephen contacted our office about 10 days ago, claiming he was helping coordinate your move. He told our receptionist that you were having some mobility issues and had asked him to arrange furniture deliveries and various installations. He was very convincing, apparently, providing details about the property that made his story credible. The calculated nature of Stephen's deception made Helen's stomach turn, and someone believed this without verifying with me directly. One of our newest administrative staff members, yes, Patricia confirmed. She provided a key to him, thinking she was being helpful to a client. I've already initiated disciplinary proceedings. This is a serious breach of our protocols, and I take full responsibility for my office's failure. We'll be implementing additional verification procedures immediately to ensure this never happens again." By that afternoon, a locksmith had changed every external lock on the house, and Patrick had helped Helen upgrade the security system to include alerts for any attempted use of invalid keys at any entrance. Thomas, meanwhile, had drafted a formal notice of trespass that could be presented if necessary, along with documentation of the key deception and the unauthorized entry. "Are you absolutely certain you want to take such a confrontational approach?" Thomas asked as they reviewed the documents that evening. "Once certain legal boundaries are established this explicitly, it becomes very difficult to return to a more casual family relationship. You need to be prepared for potential permanent damage to these relationships." Helen considered his words carefully, looking out at the mountains that had become her sanctuary. "I'm not doing this primarily to punish them, Thomas," she said quietly. "I'm doing it to establish clear boundaries that should have existed all along. For too long, they've treated me as an accessory to their lives, someone to be included or excluded purely at their convenience based on what served their interests. That pattern ends now, or we have no relationship at all." Patrick arrived that evening with takeout from a local Thai restaurant, joining Thomas and Helen for what became an impromptu strategy session. As a law enforcement officer, his perspective proved invaluable for understanding the legal implications of their plan. Based on the security footage, they clearly entered without permission, Patrick confirmed. That constitutes criminal trespass under state law. However, they could potentially argue they believed they had implicit permission since Stephen obtained the key through what appeared to be legitimate channels, at least from his perspective. "So what are our realistic options?" Helen asked, picking at her pad thai without much appetite. "Several approaches," Patrick said thoughtfully. "Most severe would be to report the trespass officially, which could result in criminal charges. That would create a formal record, but would also likely destroy any chance of repairing these relationships. Less severe would be to prevent their entry when they arrive and simply inform them they're not welcome without a proper invitation. That makes the boundary clear, but doesn't involve legal action." Thomas raised a third possibility. "Or you could allow them to enter on your terms," he suggested. "Let them arrive thinking they're surprising you, only to discover you're fully prepared and in complete control of the situation. A psychological approach rather than purely legal, but potentially very effective for demonstrating that you're not the person they think you are." That option resonated with Helen immediately. After years of being dismissed and marginalized, there was a certain appeal to completely turning the tables. "I like that approach," she decided. "Let them come thinking I'll be pathetically grateful for their attention, only to discover I've built a life that doesn't revolve around waiting for them to remember I exist." They spent the next 2 hours outlining a detailed plan. Thomas would arrive early on the expected day, providing legal backup if needed. Patrick would be present in his official capacity, his uniform serving as a clear symbol of authority and consequence. And Helen would be ready to reclaim her narrative completely, to show her children that their mother was not who they assumed her to be. "There's one more thing I need to do," Helen said, as their planning session concluded. "I need to know exactly what they're expecting, which means I need to speak with the one person who won't lie to me because he doesn't know any better." The next morning, Helen called Tyler under the pretext of asking what he wanted for the holidays. "We're coming to see you," Tyler blurted excitedly before Helen could even broach the subject. "Dad says we're all going to your new house for the holidays. It's supposed to be a surprise, but I already know because I heard him talking to Mom about it." "That sounds wonderful, sweetheart," Helen said, keeping her tone light and encouraging. "Did your dad happen to mention when you're all planning to arrive?" "The night before the holiday," Tyler said, with the precise recall of a 9-year-old who had been listening carefully to adult conversations. We're bringing all our presents and staying for 3 whole days. Mum's been making lists of which rooms everyone gets, and she says your house has enough space for everyone to have their own bedroom." Helen felt her jaw tighten, but kept her voice warm for Tyler's sake. "How thoughtful of your mother to plan sleeping arrangements for my house. Dad says it's the perfect place for our family holiday traditions," Tyler continued innocently. "He's bringing the special drink that grown-ups have. And Aunt Jennifer is planning where to put the Christmas tree. Uncle Brian says there's probably a hot tub or something cool like that." Each detail was a fresh revelation of their presumption. They were not merely planning a visit. They were appropriating her home entirely, imposing their traditions in her space without a single consideration for whether she might have made her own plans or had her own preferences. After ending the call with Tyler, Helen sat in stunned silence for several minutes. The completeness of their entitlement was breathtaking. They had not just excluded her from their holiday plans for 6 consecutive years. They now intended to commandeer her private retreat for their own convenience, treating her property as if it were family community space they could access at will. That evening, when Patrick stopped by to install several additional security cameras at strategic points around the property, Helen shared what she had learned from Tyler. "They're planning to stay for 3 days," she explained, still struggling to fully process the audacity. "They've already decided which rooms they'll occupy, where they'll put their tree. Everything. Not a single one of them has actually asked if they're welcome here or if I might have made other plans." Patrick's expression darkened as he processed this information. "This goes well beyond presumptuous," he said flatly. "They're treating your home as community property, as if your ownership is somehow negotiable or shared simply because you're related to them." "Exactly," Helen said, handing him a mug of tea, "which means our reception needs to be absolutely crystal clear. This is my home, my life, my choice about who enters and who doesn't. They need to understand that fundamental reality." "Are you prepared for the potential fallout?" Patrick asked gently. "Family confrontations around major holidays can leave lasting damage that's difficult to repair. You need to go into this with open eyes about the possible consequences." Helen gazed out at the snow-covered mountains, their enduring presence a reminder of her own newfound strength. "The damage has already been done, Patrick," she said quietly. "For 6 years, they've shown me exactly where I stand in their lives through their actions, regardless of their occasional words. All I'm doing now is showing them where they stand in mine, and what the boundaries will be going forward if we're to have any relationship at all." The morning of the holiday eve dawned clear and crystalline, sunlight glittering across untouched snow like scattered diamonds. Helen woke early, propelled through her morning routine by a mixture of determination and nervous energy that left her feeling simultaneously anxious and powerful. Today, everything would change. Either the beginning of honest relationships with her children built on mutual respect, or the final acknowledgement that those relationships had been irreparably damaged by years of thoughtless neglect. She had spent the previous day transforming the house into exactly the holiday environment she wanted to create. No concessions to her children's preferences, no accommodations for grandchildren she rarely saw. Instead, she decorated with elegant simplicity. White lights woven through fresh pine garlands on the mantelpiece, a small, sophisticated tree adorned with the antique glass ornaments her mother had left her, and refined table settings for exactly 3 people, herself, Thomas and Patrick, for an intimate holiday eve dinner. The guest rooms remained conspicuously untouched. No extra linen set out, no welcome baskets, no preparations for unexpected visitors. Every aspect of the house made one clear statement: "This is my home, arranged for my pleasure and my guests, not a hotel awaiting your unannounced arrival." At 9:30, Thomas called to confirm his plans. "I'll arrive around 2 o'clock, he said. "That should give us plenty of time to review everything once more before your children's expected arrival around 5 or 6. "Perfect," Helen replied. Patrick is coming at 1 to help with final security preparations and to change into his uniform here. I want everything in place well before they arrive. How are you feeling about all of this, Helen? Thomas asked, his voice softening with concern. This is a significant confrontation you're initiating. Helen considered the question carefully, looking out at the pristine winter landscape. Remarkably calm, actually, she replied. For the first time in years, I feel completely in control of my own life and circumstances. Whatever happens today, it will be on my terms, not theirs. After ending the call, Helen examined her reflection in the full-length mirror in her bedroom. She had chosen her outfit with deliberate care. Not the comfortable but shapeless clothes her children were accustomed to seeing her in, but a well-tailored burgundy dress that highlighted her still trim figure. The dress was paired with the pearl necklace Robert had given her for their 30th anniversary and elegant heeled boots that added 2 inches to her height. Her silver hair was styled in a modern cut that framed her face with sophistication rather than matronly practicality, and she had taken extra care with makeup, emphasizing her eyes and adding color to her cheeks. The woman looking back at her from the mirror did not resemble anyone's fading elderly grandmother. She looked confident, sophisticated, vital, and very much in command of her circumstances and her environment. Patrick arrived precisely at 1 o'clock, dressed in his full police uniform rather than the casual clothes Helen had grown accustomed to seeing him wear during their friendly encounters. The official appearance was intentional and strategic. They had agreed his presence should communicate authority and potential consequences rather than merely friendship or neighborly support. "Roads are clear all the way from town," he reported, removing his boots in the entryway. "No traffic issues that might delay their arrival, so we should expect them any time after 4 o'clock, probably closer to 5 or 6, based on typical travel patterns from the city." "Good," Helen said. "Everything needs to proceed on our timeline, not theirs. They think they're surprising me, but the surprise will be entirely theirs." They spent the next 45 minutes reviewing the security system one final time and confirming their strategy. Patrick had positioned additional cameras to capture the driveway approach and every possible entrance to the house. All feeds were now displayed on multiple devices simultaneously, the monitoring station in Helen's office, Patrick's tablet, and Helen's phone, ensuring comprehensive awareness of her family's arrival and movements. "Remember," Patrick said as they finished their review, "you're in complete control here. This is your house, your rules, your boundaries. Don't let them flip the script or make you defensive about choices that are entirely yours to make." "I won't," Helen promised, grateful for his steady, professional presence and support. When Thomas arrived at precisely 2 o'clock, bringing a bottle of expensive champagne for celebrating afterward, the 3 of them conducted a final walkthrough of the house. Every detail was perfect, from the elegant holiday decorations to the tantalizing aroma of beef Wellington slowly cooking in the oven. A sophisticated holiday eve dinner for exactly 3 people. "The table settings are a particularly effective touch," Thomas observed, nodding at the dining room with its 3 carefully arranged place settings. "The physical evidence that you weren't expecting them, that you had made other plans, speaks volumes without requiring words." "That's precisely the point," Helen agreed. "I've moved forward with my life. I've created my own traditions and my own circle. They need to understand that I'm no longer waiting by the phone for their attention or organizing my life around the possibility they might include me." At 3:45, Patrick's tablet chimed with an alert. "Vehicle approaching," he announced, showing them the feed from the camera positioned at the entrance to the private road. Stephen's luxury SUV was in the lead, followed closely by Jennifer's crossover and Brian's sports car. Helen felt her pulse quicken, but kept her breathing steady as she watched the procession of vehicles make their way up her driveway. "I count 10 people," she said, identifying each family member as they parked and began emerging from their cars. All three of her children, their spouses and 5 grandchildren, ranging from Tyler's 9 years to Jennifer's daughter Sophie's 15. 10 people arriving unannounced for a 3-day stay, expecting a grateful and accommodating reception. The presumption was staggering. Patrick took up his position near the kitchen, visible from the entry but not immediately confrontational. Thomas positioned himself in the living room, briefcase open with documents ready. Helen smoothed her dress, took a deep breath to center herself, and moved to wait near the door with deliberate, unhurried calm. Jennifer reached the front entrance first, and Helen watched on her phone as her daughter tried the new locks with the key they had obtained. Confusion crossed Jennifer's face when the key did not work. After several more attempts and a brief consultation with Stephen, she finally pressed the doorbell instead. The chime echoed through the house. Helen counted to 5, refusing to rush, before walking calmly to open the door. Surprise! Multiple voices chorused simultaneously as Helen opened the door. Their faces were arranged in expressions of exaggerated excitement that faltered immediately when they registered Helen's appearance. Elegant, composed, obviously not surprised at all, and certainly not dressed like someone spending a quiet holiday alone. "Hello," Helen said pleasantly, her tone perfectly polite but making no move to step aside and allow entry. "This is unexpected." Michael recovered first, his salesman's smile sliding back into place with practiced ease. "Merry Christmas, Mom. We thought we'd surprise you with a family holiday at your beautiful new place." He gestured expansively at the assembled group behind him. "Everyone's here, the whole family together." "So I see," Helen replied evenly, still blocking the doorway. "How thoughtful of you to decide how I should spend the holiday in my own home without consulting me about whether that suited my plans." An uncomfortable silence descended as her less than enthusiastic response registered. Amanda, Stephen's wife, shifted awkwardly beside him, while the younger grandchildren looked confused by the unexpected tension. Jennifer's husband checked his watch impatiently. "Mom," Jennifer said with a nervous laugh, "it's freezing out here. Can we please come inside?" "That depends," Helen said calmly. "Did any of you consider calling to ask if I was available to host 10 people for the holidays, or whether I had made my own plans?" Brian stepped forward, employing the cajoling tone he used when he thought she was being unreasonably difficult. "Come on, Mom, don't be like this. We wanted to surprise you. You're always saying you want to see more of the grandchildren. A surprise visit should make you happy." "A surprise visit might be dropping by for coffee on a weekend afternoon, Brian," Helen corrected him firmly. "Not arriving with luggage for a 3-day stay without any invitation whatsoever." Stephen's expression was darkening with frustration. "Mom, you're being ridiculous about this. It's the holidays. Family should be together. That's what the holidays are about." "I agree completely," Helen said, "which is why it's so interesting that this is the first holiday in 6 years that any of you have wanted to include me in your plans." Rather coincidentally, this sudden interest in family togetherness emerged right after I purchased this desirable mountain property. The stunned silence that followed was broken by Tyler's innocent voice. "Daddy, you said Grandma would be happy to see us." His confusion was genuine and heartbreaking. The question nearly broke Helen's resolve, but she reminded herself this was not about punishing her grandchildren. This was about establishing boundaries their parents had trampled for years. "I am always happy to see you, Tyler," Helen said gently, meeting his eyes with warmth. "But right now I need to have an important conversation with your parents about some grown-up matters. Why don't you all come inside where it's warm, and we'll sort this out properly?" She stepped aside finally, allowing them to enter the foyer. They immediately noticed Patrick standing in his police uniform near the kitchen doorway, watching silently with professional attention. Stephen froze mid-step. "Mom, why is there a police officer in your house?" he asked, his voice rising with confusion and perhaps the first hint of concern. "This is Officer Patrick Morrison," Helen said, closing the front door behind her bewildered family. "He's here because I have serious concerns about unauthorized entry to my home." "Unauthorized entry?" Jennifer's voice rose sharply. "What are you talking about? We're your family." "Perhaps we should all move to the living room," Helen suggested calmly, her voice carrying absolute authority in her own home. "Children, there's hot chocolate and cookies in the kitchen if you'd like some. The adults need to have a discussion." Amanda hesitantly shepherded the younger grandchildren toward the kitchen, while 15-year-old Sophie and 13-year-old Jacob remained. Clearly intrigued by the unfolding adult drama, Thomas stepped forward from his position in the living room. "I'm Thomas Caldwell," he introduced himself with professional courtesy, Mrs. Garrison's attorney and longtime family friend. "Attorney?" Stephen's face flushed dark red. "Mom, what the hell is going on here? Why do you have an attorney present?" Helen gestured toward the comfortable seating area. "Please sit down. We have important matters to discuss before we determine whether this surprise visit of yours can proceed as you planned." They complied reluctantly, exchanging alarmed glances as they arranged themselves on the sofas facing the fireplace. Helen remained standing deliberately, a conscious choice to maintain the position of authority in her own home. "3 days ago," Helen began, her voice steady and clear, "Jennifer and Brian entered this house without my knowledge or permission, using a key that Stephen obtained through deliberate deception." "That's absurd," Brian protested immediately. "We were just checking out the place," Jennifer interjected quickly, shooting him a warning glance. "We were excited about your new home, Mom. That's all. Just wanted to see it." "So excited that you didn't bother to call first?" Helen interrupted. "So excited that you didn't knock or announce yourselves. So excited that you waited until you thought I'd be away." She gestured toward the large monitor on the wall, which Patrick had cued with the security footage. "Perhaps this will refresh your memory about exactly what happened." The screen came to life, showing Jennifer and Brian furtively approaching the front door 3 days earlier, looking around before Jennifer used the key. Their recorded voices filled the suddenly silent room as they wandered through Helen's house without permission, making comments about the furniture and finishes, discussing which bedrooms they would claim for their families, and speculating about Helen's finances. Stephen's already making plans. Jennifer's recorded voice echoed through the room. "We're all coming up for the holidays. Surprise her with a big family Christmas. It'll be perfect." Her recorded laughter followed. "As if this is somehow still her decision to make," she had said. "It's family property now, whether she realizes it or not." Helen paused the footage, observing their reactions carefully. Jennifer's face had drained of all color. Brian stared at his shoes with intense focus. Stephen looked thunderstruck, perhaps realizing his siblings had implicated him directly in their recorded conversation. Jennifer finally managed to speak. "That's an invasion of privacy. You can't just record people without their knowledge. That's probably illegal." Actually, Patrick spoke for the first time, his official tone filling the room with authority. "Homeowners have the complete legal right to maintain security systems on their property, including comprehensive video surveillance. What they don't have the right to do is enter someone else's home without permission, which constitutes criminal trespass under state law." "We had a key," Brian protested weakly. "Stephen got us a key. That's not breaking in." "Obtained through false pretense and deliberate deception," Thomas countered smoothly, stepping forward with documentation in hand. "Stephen contacted the real estate office claiming Mrs. Garrison needed assistance due to mobility issues, a complete fabrication designed to gain unauthorized access to her property. The key was obtained under false pretenses, which makes its use in entering the property without permission even more legally problematic." All eyes turned to Stephen, whose carefully maintained composure had completely evaporated. "I was just trying to help," he said weakly, the excuse sounding hollow even to his own ears. We wanted to see the place before the holidays to make sure it was suitable and safe for you." "You could have asked," Helen said simply, her voice cutting through his rationalization. "You could have called and said, 'Mom, we'd love to see your new home. May we visit?' Instead, you chose deception, invasion, and presumption at every step." Presumption? Amanda had returned from settling the younger children in the kitchen. "We're family, Helen. Family doesn't need formal invitations to visit each other. That's not how families work." "Apparently, I do need formal invitations," Helen replied, meeting Amanda's gaze steadily. "For 6 years, I've needed an invitation to holiday gatherings that never came. 6 years of, we're keeping it small this year, and we've made other plans that don't really accommodate additional people. 6 years of seeing my grandchildren only when it was convenient for you, not when I wanted to be part of their lives. 6 years of being excluded from family events, while simultaneously having my lifestyle criticized and my independence questioned." A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Sophie, old enough to understand the full implications, looked between her parents and Helen with dawning comprehension and what appeared to be horror. "You never invited Grandma for the holidays?" she asked her mother directly, her voice sharp with accusation. "Not even once in 6 years. How could you do that?" Jennifer shifted uncomfortably. "It's complicated, honey," she said, the weak explanation failing to satisfy anyone. "These things are more complex than they seem from the outside. It's actually quite simple," Helen corrected gently but firmly. "I became inconvenient and uncomfortable after your grandfather died. Too much effort to include. Too old-fashioned for your modern celebrations. Too unnecessary, until I acquired something you found desirable. This house. And suddenly I'm worthy of inclusion in your family holiday. Suddenly you remember I exist and might want to be part of family traditions." "That's not fair," Stephen protested, though his voice lacked any conviction. "You're making it sound more deliberate than it was." "Isn't it fair?" Helen challenged him directly. "Then explain why you told Tyler I was busy this holiday when you had never bothered to ask if I had plans. Explain why you felt entitled to enter my home without permission. Explain why you brought luggage for a 3-day stay, without once considering whether I might want 10 unexpected house guests or might have made other plans for my holiday." No one seemed able to formulate any response that didn't further incriminate them. Patrick shifted slightly in his position, his uniform catching the light, a visual reminder of the potential consequences hovering over the situation. "Are we?" Brian finally ventured carefully. "Are we being charged with something criminal?" "That depends entirely on you," Helen answered. "I have no desire to press charges against my own children. What I want, what I require, is acknowledgement, genuine respect and honest connection moving forward, not to be treated as an afterthought or a convenience, not to have my home treated as community property you can access at will." Thomas stepped forward, holding the documents he had prepared. "Mrs. Garrison has prepared a statement of understanding," he explained. "It formally acknowledges the unauthorized entry that occurred, establishes clear expectations about future visits requiring explicit invitation, and outlines a path forward for rebuilding family relationships based on mutual respect and consideration." "You want us to sign a contract to visit our own mother?" Jennifer asked incredulously, her voice rising. "That's insane. We're family." "No," Helen corrected her firmly. "I want you to recognize and acknowledge that I am a complete person with autonomy, boundaries and feelings that matter, not a resource to be accessed when convenient and ignored when not. Not a supporting character in your lives who exists solely to provide childcare or validation when you decide you need it. The document is merely formal acknowledgement of that basic reality." The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. Then an unexpected voice broke through the tension. "I'll sign it," Sophie announced, standing up from where she'd been sitting beside her mother. "Grandma deserves so much better than how we've all treated her. This whole thing is awful, and I'm ashamed I didn't realize what was happening before now." The simple statement from a 15-year-old cut through the defensive positions and rationalizations like a blade. Jennifer looked at her daughter in surprise, then slowly turned back to Helen, really seeing her perhaps for the first time in years. "Mom," Jennifer began, her carefully maintained facade cracking visibly. "We never meant to make you feel excluded or unimportant. You have to believe that wasn't our intention." "Intentions matter less than actions," Helen replied, not unkindly but without backing down. "For 6 years your actions have spoken clearly about my place in your lives, regardless of whatever intentions you might claim now." Stephen, ever the pragmatist, was visibly assessing the situation with new clarity and obvious concern. "So where does this leave us now?" he asked carefully. "Are we supposed to just leave? Drive back to the city on Christmas Eve after coming all this way?" Helen looked around at her children, their spouses, and her grandchildren who were innocent victims in this adult conflict. She thought about the carefully prepared dinner for 3 in her dining room, the plans she had made for a quiet, dignified holiday on her own terms. She thought about 6 years of loneliness and exclusion, of being forgotten and dismissed. "That," she said finally, "depends entirely on what happens in the next few minutes. On whether you can genuinely acknowledge what you've done and commit to real change in how you treat me going forward." For several long moments no one spoke. The only sounds were the crackling fire and the distant voices of the younger children in the kitchen, mercifully unaware of the confrontation unfolding in the living room. Helen remained standing, watching her 3 adult children process the reality of their situation, caught in their deception, confronted with clear evidence, and finally facing actual consequences for years of thoughtless behavior. Stephen was the first to recover, his businessman's instinct for damage control and negotiation engaging despite his obvious discomfort. "Mom, clearly we've made some serious mistakes here," he began, his tone shifting to conciliatory. "We absolutely should have called first. That's obvious now. The whole situation with the key was inappropriate and wrong. I can see that now." "Inappropriate?" Helen repeated the word, letting its inadequacy hang in the air between them. "Breaking into my home, planning to commandeer it for your holiday convenience for multiple days, treating my property as if my ownership is somehow negotiable or shared. That goes well beyond merely inappropriate, Stephen." Jennifer wiped discreetly at her eyes, her carefully applied makeup beginning to smudge and run. "We never thought of it as breaking in," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion. "In our minds you'd be happy and grateful to have us all here together finally. We thought we were doing something good, without asking me first," Helen emphasized, "without considering that I might have made my own plans after 6 consecutive years of solitary holidays, without any thought for what I might want or need." Brian, who typically reacted to criticism with defensiveness, shifted restlessly in his seat. "You're making it sound like we deliberately excluded you all these years with malicious intent," he said. "That's not fair to us. We've all been busy. Lives get complicated with work and kids and everything else. It wasn't personal." "Too busy for a single phone call?" Helen interrupted, her patience with excuses finally exhausted. "Too complicated to extend a simple invitation. I never expected any of you to prioritize me above your own immediate families, Brian. I just wanted to be considered part of those families instead of being systematically excluded from every gathering and tradition." Sophie stood up suddenly, her teenage sense of justice clearly offended. "I want to know why we never visited Grandma for the holidays," she announced, looking directly at her mother with accusation in her eyes. "You always told me she preferred quiet holidays by herself. You said she didn't like traveling in winter weather and wanted to stay home. You made it sound like it was her choice." Jennifer flinched visibly at her daughter's words. "Sophie, please," she said weakly. "This isn't the appropriate time for this discussion." "It's exactly the right time," Helen countered firmly. "Sophie deserves honest answers, as do all the grandchildren. I never said I preferred quiet holidays alone, Sophie. Quite the opposite, in fact. I've called every December for 6 years asking about holiday plans, hoping for an invitation that never came." Amanda cleared her throat, drawing attention. "In all fairness, Helen," she said carefully, "you have to admit you don't exactly fit with how we usually do our celebrations anymore. The children have certain expectations for the holidays. We've established traditions over the years that work for our immediate families. Traditions that deliberately excluded their grandmother." Helen finished for her. "How convenient to establish traditions that justified leaving me out while making it sound like a reasonable choice rather than a hurtful exclusion." Patrick shifted slightly from his position near the doorway, a subtle reminder of his presence and the serious nature of the situation. "Perhaps," he suggested in his professional tone, "this would be an appropriate moment to consider the agreement Mr. Caldwell mentioned earlier. It might provide a framework for moving forward constructively." Thomas stepped forward with the document, offering it to Stephen as the eldest. "This isn't legally binding in a traditional contract sense," he explained carefully. "Rather, it's a clear articulation of boundaries and expectations going forward. A reset of the relationship, if you will, with explicit acknowledgement of what went wrong and commitment to doing better." Stephen accepted the papers, scanning them with a deepening frown. "This feels excessive and formal," he said. "We're family. We shouldn't need written agreements and legal documentation to have normal family relationships." "Apparently we do," Helen replied evenly. "Because verbal understandings, basic respect, and common courtesy haven't been sufficient up to this point. 6 years of exclusion, followed by an unauthorized invasion of my home, makes that abundantly clear." As Stephen continued reading through the document with obvious reluctance, Tyler appeared in the doorway from the kitchen. His small face was troubled and confused by the adult tension he could sense, even if he didn't fully understand it. "Is Christmas cancelled?" he asked in a small voice, looking around at all the tense adult faces. "Did we do something wrong? Are we going home now?" The innocent question pierced through the confrontation, reminding everyone that the grandchildren were blameless in this situation, caught in conflicts they hadn't created. Whatever grievances Helen had with her adult children, the little ones deserved joy and celebration, not tension and anger. "No, sweetheart," Helen answered gently, crouching down to his eye level. "Christmas isn't cancelled. We're just working through some grown-up problems so we can figure out the best way to celebrate together. Sometimes adults need to have difficult conversations to make things better." Amanda moved to shepherd Tyler back toward the kitchen, but Helen raised her hand to stop her. "Actually, let's have all the children join us," she said firmly. "They should understand what's happening here, at least in age-appropriate terms. This affects them too." After the remaining grandchildren were gathered, ranging from Tyler's 9 years to Sophie's 15, Helen addressed them directly, speaking to them with the same respect she would show adults. "I love all of you very much," she began, making eye contact with each young face, "and I've missed you terribly during all the holidays we haven't shared over the past 6 years. Your parents and I are trying to figure out how we can be a better family going forward, where everyone feels included, valued, and respected." Tyler, bless his 9-year-old wisdom, frowned thoughtfully. "Like when you tell us to use our words instead of just grabbing toys from each other," he asked, "and to ask permission before we take things that aren't ours." A ripple of uncomfortable laughter moved through the adults, the simple childhood parallel cutting straight to the heart of the matter with devastating accuracy. "Exactly like that," Helen agreed, feeling a swell of affection for her youngest grandson's insight. Sometimes even grown-ups need reminders about sharing, being considerate of others' feelings, and asking permission before making decisions that affect other people. Stephen set down the agreement document, his expression conflicted and troubled. "Mom," he said quietly, "can we have a few minutes to discuss this privately? Just as siblings?" Helen nodded, gesturing toward the study. "Take all the time you need," she said. "The rest of us will wait here." As her 3 children filed out to confer privately, Helen turned her full attention to her grandchildren, asking about school, their activities and interests, their friends and hobbies. She was making up for lost time in small but meaningful ways, re-establishing connections that had been allowed to atrophy through years of limited contact. Thomas discreetly stepped outside to give the family privacy, while Patrick moved to the kitchen to prepare coffee, his continued presence a reminder, but not an immediate pressure. Approximately 20 minutes later, Stephen, Jennifer, and Brian returned to the living room. Something in their collective demeanor had shifted noticeably, a newfound sobriety and seriousness replacing their earlier defensiveness and rationalization. "We've talked it through," Stephen said, serving as spokesperson for his siblings, "and we owe you an apology, a real, genuine apology, not excuses or justifications." He took a deep breath, visibly composing himself before continuing. "After Dad died, it was easier to build our holiday celebrations around our children's immediate needs and our social obligations than to really consider how lonely you must have been. We told ourselves you were fine, that you understood, that this was just how things worked out naturally. We didn't want to face the reality that we were actively excluding you." Jennifer stepped forward, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "The truth is, I didn't want to face holidays without Dad," she said, her voice breaking. "Being at family gatherings reminded me too strongly that he was gone, and it felt easier emotionally to just create some distance and avoid those feelings. I never properly considered how much worse that made everything for you, dealing with his loss while also losing your connection to your family. And when we discovered you had purchased this beautiful mountain home," Brian added, his usual bravado completely absent, "we were shocked, confused, and yes, opportunistic about it. Instead of being happy that you'd found a new chapter and built something for yourself, we immediately thought about how it could benefit us and serve our purposes. That was selfish and wrong." Stephen picked up the agreement document again. "We'll sign this, Mum," he said quietly. "Not because we think we need a legal contract to behave like decent, considerate human beings. We shouldn't need that, but we'll sign it as a symbol of our genuine commitment to do better, to be better, to treat you with the respect and consideration you've always deserved. And we completely understand if you want us to leave right now," Jennifer added, her voice steadier now. "We arrived uninvited, presumptuous, and entitled. Your feelings and your plans are the priority here, not ours. We have no right to expect you to accommodate us after everything." Helen looked at her children carefully, really looked at them, seeing beyond her accumulated hurt to the flawed, complicated adults they had become. In their faces, she could see traces of Robert, of herself, of the babies she had once held through long nights, and the teenagers she had guided through various crises. They were imperfect people who had made genuinely selfish choices, yes, but they were still her children, still her family. "I don't want you to leave," Helen said finally, her voice firm but not unkind. "But I do want you to understand something fundamental. This is my home, built and furnished according to my preferences, reflecting my current life. You are welcome here when invited, when respectful of my time and space, and when genuinely interested in me as a complete person, rather than what I can provide for you." She gestured toward the elegant dining table with its carefully arranged settings for 3. "I had specific plans for tonight. Dinner with Thomas and Patrick, 2 people who have shown me more genuine consideration in recent weeks than my own children have demonstrated in years. Those plans will proceed as originally intended." Taking a deep breath, Helen continued with her proposal. "However, There's an excellent lodge in town, with comfortable accommodations and last-minute availability. I suggest you all get settled there for tonight. Then tomorrow, on the holiday itself, you're welcome to return here as properly invited guests. We'll have an appropriate holiday meal, exchange gifts, and begin the genuine process of rebuilding what's been broken between us. A mixture of relief, chastened understanding, and perhaps even respect passed across their faces as they realized Helen was offering a path forward, not unconditional forgiveness, but an opportunity to earn back their place in her life through changed behavior. "That sounds more than fair," Stephen said quietly. "More generous than we have any right to expect, honestly." As they gathered their belongings and prepared to depart for the lodge, Sophie approached Helen hesitantly, as if unsure of her welcome after the confrontation she had just witnessed. "Grandma Helen," she began carefully, "would it be okay if I stayed here with you tonight? I'd really like to help prepare for tomorrow and spend some time with you, if that's all right." The request, so genuine and untainted by the adult complications that had poisoned other relationships, touched Helen deeply. "I would like that very much," she replied, embracing her granddaughter for the first time in far too long. "Very much indeed." After the caravan of vehicles had departed down the mountain toward town, an extraordinary stillness settled over the house, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the soft sounds of Sophie unpacking her overnight bag in one of the guest rooms. Patrick excused himself to change out of his uniform, promising to return within the hour for the dinner they had originally planned. Thomas opened the bottle of champagne he had brought, pouring 3 glasses, one for himself, one for Helen, and one for Sophie, which Helen diluted with sparkling cider, despite Sophie's protests that 15 was practically adult in most of Europe. "Well," Thomas said, raising his glass with a wry smile, "that went rather differently than I expected when we started planning this intervention." "Did it?" Helen took a thoughtful sip, savoring the crisp bubbles. "They reacted exactly as they always have, with surprise that I might have needs and boundaries of my own, that I might not be willing to simply accommodate whatever they decide to impose on me. But they signed the agreement," Sophie pointed out, clearly still processing everything she had witnessed. "That has to mean something, doesn't it, that they're willing to try?" "It's a beginning," Helen acknowledged carefully, "but actions over time will matter far more than signatures on a document. Words and promises are easy. Following through consistently when it's inconvenient or requires actual effort, that's the real test." As Patrick returned in civilian clothes and they settled in for their originally planned dinner, Sophie watched the 3 adults with curious, observant eyes. The elegant table, the sophisticated menu, the easy conversation flowing between Helen, Thomas, and Patrick. It was clearly not the grandmother she thought she knew, not the person her parents had described. "You're different here," Sophie observed, as Helen served the perfectly prepared beef Wellington. "More yourself somehow, more real." "That's perceptive," Helen said with an approving smile. "For a very long time after your grandfather died, I defined myself entirely by my relationships to other people. Robert's widow, your parents' mother, your and Tyler's, and the other's grandmother. This place represents the first major decision I've made solely for myself in decades." "Why didn't you tell anyone about buying it before you did?" Sophie asked. "I mean, why keep it secret?" Helen considered the question carefully while cutting into her perfectly cooked beef. "I needed space to rediscover who I am when I'm not performing roles for other people or managing their expectations of me," she explained. "Your parents and uncles have had very specific ideas about who Mom should be. Quiet, accommodating, endlessly available, content with whatever scraps of attention they chose to offer. I needed to hear my own voice again, to understand my own preferences, without those expectations constantly shaping and limiting my choices." "Mom talks about you like you're fragile," Sophie said bluntly, her teenage directness cutting through any pretense. Like you couldn't handle change or complexity or modern life, like you needed to be protected from reality. But you're not like that at all, are you? That perception served their narrative, Thomas observed quietly. If Helen was too fragile to handle full family gatherings or too set in her ways to enjoy their modern celebrations, then they could exclude her without feeling guilty about it. They could tell themselves they were protecting her rather than admitting they simply found her presence inconvenient. "That's really harsh," Sophie protested, though her expression suggested she recognized the truth in his words despite not wanting to. "But accurate," Helen said gently, reaching over to squeeze Sophie's hand. "It's not a pleasant realization, I know, watching your parents' behavior from this new perspective. But part of growing up is recognizing that parents are flawed, complicated humans, not the perfect authorities we imagine them to be in childhood. They make mistakes, sometimes serious ones, just like everyone else." Their dinner stretched into a long evening of honest, searching conversation. Sophie asked questions about Robert, about Helen's life before marriage and children, about her university teaching career, about books and ideas and experiences. These were subjects her parents had rarely explored with Helen, treating her past as irrelevant ancient history rather than as the foundation of a rich, complex life. When Sophie finally yawned around 11:30, her exhaustion evident, Helen showed her to the blue guest room with its magnificent view of the moonlit mountains. This would have been Mom and Uncle Stephen's and Uncle Brian's rooms if they'd stayed tonight, wouldn't it? Sophie asked, taking in the elegant furnishings and the comfortable bed. All of them had probably already decided which rooms they'd take. "Your mother has always preferred blue," Helen confirmed. "She probably had already planned to claim this room, yes." "I'm glad they're not here tonight," Sophie confessed quietly. "It's nice having you to myself for once, without everyone else's drama and demands competing for attention." After Sophie had settled in for the night, Helen rejoined Thomas and Patrick in the living room, where they sat nursing nightcaps of excellent whiskey by the fire. "She's a remarkable young woman," Thomas observed, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "Far more insightful and emotionally mature than her mother was at that age, than her mother is now, frankly. She reminds me of you," Patrick added with a warm smile, clear-eyed about people's motivations, willing to speak uncomfortable truths, unwilling to accept convenient fictions just because they're easier. "I was never that perceptive at 15, Helen protested with a laugh, accepting a small pour of the whiskey. "But I hope Sophie maintains that clarity as she grows. It will serve her well, even when it makes relationships more complicated." "What about tomorrow?" Patrick asked, returning to practical matters. "Are you ready for the full family gathering? It's going to be emotionally complex." Helen considered this carefully, watching the firelight dance across the ceiling. "I think so," she replied. "Today wasn't primarily about punishing them, though I won't pretend there wasn't some satisfaction in reversing the power dynamic. It was about establishing that I'm not a supporting character in their lives, that I have agency and boundaries and expectations of my own. They needed that wake-up call, perhaps desperately. They certainly got it," Thomas agreed, "though I suspect old habits and patterns will try to reassert themselves if you're not vigilant. Change is difficult, and people often slip back into familiar behaviors when the immediate pressure is off." "Probably true," Helen acknowledged. "But I'm not the same person they could dismiss so easily anymore. This house isn't just a physical structure. It's a statement about who I am now and how I expect to be treated going forward. That foundation doesn't disappear just because they've signed a piece of paper." After Thomas and Patrick departed with promises to check in the next day, Helen found herself alone in her mountain sanctuary, reflecting on the day's dramatic confrontation and its surprisingly constructive resolution. So much had changed in ways she could not have fully predicted when she first discovered her children's planned invasion of her home. She slept deeply that night, waking on the holiday morning to find Sophie already in the kitchen, attempting to make Belgian waffles using a recipe she had found on her phone. "I wanted to surprise you with breakfast," Sophie explained sheepishly, flour dusting her cheek and the counter. "But I think I misunderstood how the waffle iron works. These aren't turning out quite like the picture." Together they salvaged the breakfast operation, laughing at the mishaps and imperfect results. As they ate at the kitchen island, Sophie asked hesitantly, "Do you think today will be weird? After everything that happened yesterday?" "Almost certainly," Helen admitted honestly. "Growth and change usually involve significant discomfort, especially in family relationships that have been dysfunctional for extended periods." "Are you still angry at them?" Sophie asked, studying Helen's face carefully. Helen considered the question carefully. "Not angry, exactly," she said. "Disappointed, certainly, that it took such a dramatic confrontation to get their attention, but also cautiously hopeful that yesterday might have been the beginning of something genuinely better, assuming they follow through with actual changed behavior rather than just temporary contrition." By noon, Helen's children began arriving from the lodge, moving much more tentatively this time. They knocked respectfully and waited to be invited in, rather than presuming entry. They brought their overnight bags, but left them in their vehicles until explicitly welcomed to stay. Small changes, but meaningful ones that signaled they had absorbed at least some of yesterday's hard lessons. Stephen presented Helen with a beautifully wrapped package. "We got you something special," he explained carefully. "Before all this happened, before we knew about the house. It seems inadequate now, given everything, but we hope you'll accept it." Inside was an elegant photo album, professionally assembled with pictures spanning decades. From Helen and Robert's wedding, through the births of children and grandchildren, various family milestones and celebrations. Many of the photos Helen had never seen before, taken at gatherings from which she had been excluded. "We realized you might not have copies of a lot of these," Jennifer explained quietly, "especially the recent ones of the grandchildren from the past few years. We thought you should have them." The thoughtfulness of the gift, albeit belated, genuinely touched Helen despite her lingering hurt. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "This means a great deal to me." As the day progressed slowly, a curious transformation unfolded in the household dynamic. Without the presumption of control and ownership they had arrived with yesterday, Helen's children seemed genuinely unsure how to behave in her home. They asked permission before using the kitchen or other spaces, consulted her about activities and timing, and generally exhibited a cautiousness that, while slightly awkward, represented a meaningful shift. Brian, helping Helen prepare vegetables for the holiday dinner, broke through the careful politeness with unexpected candor. "I didn't realize how beautiful it really is here," he said quietly, focusing on the carrots he was chopping. "I can see why you chose this place specifically. It suits you somehow." "It speaks to me," Helen agreed, working beside him companionably. "The mountains have a permanence that's oddly comforting. They've been here far longer than any of our petty concerns, and will remain long after we're gone. That perspective helps. I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," Brian continued, his voice low, "about being treated as an afterthought. You were right about that. We've been deeply selfish. After Dad died, it felt easier to create distance than to face holidays with his empty chair at the table, with that constant reminder of loss." "I understand that impulse, Brian," Helen said gently. "I felt his absence more acutely than anyone possibly could, but pushing me away only compounded that loss, for all of us. We should have drawn closer together for mutual support, not drifted apart into separate islands." Brian nodded, his eyes suspiciously bright with unshed tears. "I know that now. We should have been there for you. not just expected you to quietly manage your grief alone while we focused on our own families. Similar moments of reflection and tentative reconnection occurred throughout the long day. Not dramatic apologies or complete transformations of character, but small acknowledgements of wrongdoing and genuine steps toward reconnection. By evening, as they gathered around the elaborate holiday dinner Helen had prepared, the atmosphere had evolved considerably from the strained politeness of mourning to something more authentically warm. Not perfect, not instantly healed of years of damage, but moving in a direction that felt, for the first time in 6 years, genuinely like family. The holiday dinner marked another subtle but significant shift in their family dynamic. Instead of the chaotic free-for-all that characterized holiday meals at her children's homes, where conversations fragmented into multiple simultaneous threads, children were constantly excused for electronic diversions, and the meal itself was rushed through to get to gifts or entertainment. They dined with genuine intention and presence. Helen had set the table with her finest china, not the practical everyday stoneware her children associated with their childhood home, but elegant bone china with platinum edging that Robert had given her for their 35th wedding anniversary. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight, and sterling silver flatware completed settings that created an atmosphere of true occasion rather than casual convenience. "Mum, this is genuinely beautiful," Jennifer said with evident surprise as she took her assigned place. "I don't think I've ever seen this china before. When did you get it?" "Your father gave it to me years ago for our anniversary," Helen explained, arranging the last place setting with care, but there never seemed to be an appropriate occasion to actually use it in the old house. I'd fallen into the habit of saving beautiful things for someday rather than enjoying them in the present. "Why not just use them?" Sophie asked, carefully touching the delicate platinum rim of her plate with one fingertip. "Why save them if you loved them?" Helen considered her answer thoughtfully. "I suppose I'd internalized the idea that beautiful, valuable things should be preserved for special occasions rather than risked in everyday use, that someday there would be a perfect moment worthy of bringing them out. But recent years have taught me that life is far too short for waiting rooms. Someday needs to become today." Stephen raised his eyebrows meaningfully, along with quite a few other things that have changed recently, it seems. "Yes," Helen agreed simply, meeting his gaze without apology. "Quite a few things have changed. I've changed, deliberately and by choice." Before he could respond with whatever he was planning to say, Helen asked everyone to be seated. She made a deliberate point of placing the youngest grandchildren beside their parents at the main table rather than clustered at a secondary kids' table, as had been the custom at previous family gatherings. When everyone was settled and arrangements complete, Helen remained standing at the head of the table, lifting her crystal glass. "I'd like to propose a toast," she said, her voice steady and clear as all eyes turned toward her expectantly. "To new beginnings, to honest connections, and to the courage required to rewrite stories that no longer serve us well." There was a moment of collective pause as her words registered and settled. Then glasses were raised in response throughout the table. "To family," Amanda added softly, surprising everyone with her contribution, in all its complicated, imperfect, messy glory. As they began enjoying the sophisticated meal Helen had prepared, considerably more elaborate than the traditional turkey dinner they might have expected, conversation flowed with surprising ease and depth. The children, included in adult conversation rather than relegated to a separate sphere, rose to the occasion with better manners than their parents had likely anticipated. Tyler, seated between Stephen and Amanda, turned to Helen with genuine curiosity, lighting his young face. "Grandma Helen, where did you learn to cook like this?" he asked earnestly. "It's really fancy, like a restaurant in a movie. I took cooking classes in the city last year," Helen explained, pleased by his interest. French cuisine specifically. I've always enjoyed cooking, but I wanted to expand my skills beyond the standard family meals you're all familiar with. You never mentioned taking cooking classes, Jennifer said, a note of something like accusation creeping into her tone. Why didn't we know about that? You never asked, Helen replied mildly, without heat. After your father died, I developed several new interests and pursued various skills. The cooking classes, watercolor painting workshops, even some investment seminars to better understand managing finances independently. I've had quite a full life these past few years. Brian looked genuinely surprised, as if this information fundamentally challenged his understanding. I had no idea you were interested in investments and financial management, he said. I always thought Dad handled all that, and you just went along with his decisions. There's quite a bit you don't know about me, Helen acknowledged without rancor or blame. I've changed substantially over the past 6 years, developed new facets of my identity and personality, discovered interests I didn't even know I had when I was busy being a wife and mother full-time. I'm starting to see that pretty clearly, Brian admitted quietly, and realizing how little effort we've made to actually know you as a complete person rather than just in your role as our mother. As dinner progressed through multiple courses, Helen observed her family with fresh perspective. Without the weight of her expectations for inclusion and their expectations for her conformity to their image of her, they were discovering each other with renewed curiosity. Her children asked questions about her life they had never bothered to pose before, about her university teaching, her research interests, her friendships, her daily routines. The grandchildren, witnessing this more authentic and engaged interaction, joined in with their own questions, clearly intrigued by aspects of their grandmother they had never previously encountered. After the main course, they moved to the living room for coffee and individual chocolate soufflés, another technique Helen had mastered in her cooking classes. The elegant presentation elicited appreciative murmurs around the room. This is definitely different from our usual holiday celebrations, Jennifer observed, curling into an armchair with her soufflé balanced carefully on her knee. More thoughtful and intentional somehow. Less chaotic. Because this is Grandma's holiday, not just a copy of everyone else's traditions, Sophie said wisely from her spot on the floor near the fireplace. It reflects who she actually is, rather than who we expected her to be. Amanda studied Helen over her coffee cup with an expression that mixed surprise, respect, and perhaps some discomfort. I feel like we're meeting a different person than the mother-in-law I thought I'd known for 15 years, she said carefully. Not different, Helen corrected gently but firmly, just more complete and authentic. For many years I allowed myself to be defined primarily by my roles in all of your lives. Mother, grandmother, widow. I let those roles consume my entire identity. This past year especially, I've deliberately reclaimed the other aspects of who I am beyond those relational definitions. As evening deepened and shadows lengthened across the mountains beyond the windows, the younger children began showing signs of fatigue. Stephen checked his watch, then looked at Helen with careful uncertainty rather than presumption. We should probably get back to the lodge soon, he said carefully. The little ones need proper sleep in their own beds. Helen nodded, noting his careful phrasing, no longer presuming they would stay in her home overnight without explicit invitation, respecting the boundaries she had established so dramatically the previous day. Of course, she replied, though you're all welcome to return tomorrow for breakfast if you'd like. I genuinely enjoy continuing our conversation and spending more time together on better terms. Really? Jennifer looked genuinely surprised at the invitation, as if she had expected permanent exile after yesterday's confrontation. You'd actually want us to come back tomorrow? Yes, Helen said simply but warmly. Today has been healing in many important ways. I'd like to continue rebuilding what we began yesterday and today. to see if we can construct something genuine going forward. As they gathered their belongings and collected scattered wrapping paper and children's new toys, preparing for their departure, the mood was markedly and fundamentally different from their entitled arrival the previous day. Each person thanked Helen individually for dinner and hospitality, with varying degrees of sincerity and self-awareness, but all clearly acknowledging that the dynamic had shifted in ways they were still processing. Sophie hung back as the others headed toward their vehicles in the driveway, approaching Helen with obvious hesitation, as if uncertain whether yesterday's drama might have changed their newfound connection. Would it be okay if I stayed again tonight? She asked carefully. I'd really like to help with breakfast preparations tomorrow and spend more time with you, if you don't mind, I mean. The request touched Helen profoundly, this second night being even more meaningful than the first. I would genuinely like that very much, she replied warmly, embracing her granddaughter. Very much indeed. Jennifer, overhearing from the doorway, seemed about to voice an objection or concern, but visibly stopped herself, reconsidering. That would be fine, she said after a meaningful pause, if that's what you both want and Helen is comfortable with it. After the convoy of vehicles had finally departed down the mountain road toward town, Lily helped Helen clear dishes and restore the kitchen to order, moving around the space with growing familiarity and comfort. You know what I realized today, Sophie said thoughtfully, carefully drying a crystal wine glass with a soft towel. I've never really known you before now. Like, the real you as a complete person. Helen looked at her curiously. What do you mean, sweetheart? At home, in our normal lives, you're always just Grandma, Sophie explained, choosing her words carefully. The person who sends birthday cards with checks inside and listens patiently to Mom complain about work. The person who asks polite questions about school but doesn't really engage beyond surface pleasantries. But here, in this house, you're Helen. You're this whole interesting, complex person with strong opinions and diverse talents, and an interior life I never even suspected existed. It's like meeting someone completely new who's been hidden inside the grandmother I thought I knew. The insight struck Helen as profoundly perceptive for a 15-year-old, revealing depths of understanding she had not anticipated. That's very observant and mature, Lily, she said warmly. And you're right in your assessment. Is that why you wanted to stay here tonight? To get to know Helen instead of just Grandma? Partly, Sophie admitted, setting down the glass she'd been drying, but also because I really like who you are when you're being yourself, without filtering everything through what other people expect. You're interesting and real in a way that most adults in my life aren't. Most grown-ups I know are so busy performing their roles that I never see who they actually are underneath. Being your grandmother is one of my greatest joys, Sophie, Helen assured her. But you're absolutely right that those two identities aren't mutually exclusive. I can be both. A grandmother who loves you fiercely, and also Helen, a complete individual with my own interests and inner life. I just needed space to remember and reclaim all those other parts of myself that got lost after your grandfather died. Later, as they sat by the fire with mugs of hot chocolate, Sophie asked tentatively, "Do you think they'll actually change, Mom and Uncle Stephen and Uncle Brian? Or will they eventually go back to how they were before once the immediate crisis passes?" Helen considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, looking into the flames. "Old patterns and habits are incredibly powerful things," she said honestly. "I suspect there will be some backsliding, moments when they forget the lessons of this weekend and slip into old assumptions. But I've fundamentally changed the equation by establishing clear boundaries and expectations. This house makes it physically real. They can't pretend I'm just sitting around waiting for their attention anymore. I have my own life, my own space, my own priorities that don't revolve around them." "And you have Patrick and Thomas," Sophie observed, glancing around the space that so clearly expressed Helen's independence. "People who value you for who you are, not just what you can do for them." "Exactly." Helen smiled, deeply moved by her granddaughter's perception. "This house represents sanctuary and independence, yes, but it's also become a foundation for building authentic relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation." "I want to visit you here regularly," Sophie said suddenly, her voice intense with sincerity. "Not just with my parents or for big family things, just to spend time with you, to really talk and get to know you better. Would that be okay?" "More than okay," Helen assured her, profoundly touched by the request. This home was never meant to be a fortress of isolation. It was meant to be a place for living fully and authentically, which includes hosting people who genuinely want to know and spend time with me. As they prepared for bed, Sophie paused at her bedroom door with one more observation. "This has been the best holiday I can remember," she said thoughtfully. "Not because of presents or entertainment, but because it felt real and honest, like we were actually connecting as people instead of just performing family rituals." "Real and honest are excellent words for it," Helen agreed warmly. "Authentic might be another good one. That's what I've been searching for. Authenticity in relationships rather than performance." After Sophie had gone to her room, Helen stood at the great windows overlooking her mountain domain, watching fresh snow begin to fall softly over the peaks and valleys. The house around her, her house chosen for her pleasure alone, felt different tonight than it had even yesterday. No longer just a statement of independence or a refuge from exclusion, but truly the beginning of something new and positive. A place where authentic family connections might finally have room to develop and grow. Spring came to the Cascade foothills with gentle but inexorable persistence. Snow drifts melted into burbling streams and rivulets that carved new paths down the mountain slopes. Pale green buds emerged cautiously from warming branches. The world transformed from pristine white to vibrant awakening. Helen had been living in her mountain home for nearly 5 months now, watching the seasons transform the landscape just as her relationships with her children had undergone their own gradual thaw. The changes in family dynamics had not happened overnight or followed a simple linear progression. January brought tentative phone calls, carefully calibrated in tone and duration, as if her children were testing boundaries they had never had to respect before. February saw Helen's first genuine invitations to their homes, real invitations with reasonable advance notice, not last-minute obligations or guilt-driven afterthoughts. March introduced a new pattern of Sunday video calls with all the grandchildren, scheduled weekly rather than occurring sporadically when guilt or convenience prompted contact. Small, incremental changes that together represented significant shifts in how they related to each other. On this particular April morning, Helen stood on her deck with steaming coffee, surveying the property she had come to love with profound depth. The mountain air carried complex scents, pine sap warming in the sunshine, earth awakening after winter dormancy, distant wildflowers beginning their annual bloom. The sensory experience felt invigorating and peaceful simultaneously, a perfect metaphor for her current life. Her phone chimed with a text from Sophie, who had become Helen's most consistent correspondent since the dramatic holiday confrontation. "Just finished my college application essay," the message read. "Can I email it to you for feedback? It's about finding authentic voice and identity, inspired by someone remarkable I know." Helen smiled, warmth spreading through her chest as she typed back her enthusiastic agreement. Sophie's transformation over the past months had been particularly rewarding to witness and nurture. From somewhat self-absorbed teenager, primarily concerned with social status and appearance, she had evolved into a thoughtful young woman, actively developing her own value system, often quite distinct from her parents' materialistic priorities. The sound of tires on gravel drew Helen's attention to the driveway. Patrick's familiar truck appeared around the bend, and Helen felt the particular warmth she had come to associate with his presence. Since the holiday confrontation, their friendship had deepened naturally into something neither had explicitly defined, but both clearly valued. Not exactly romance, though perhaps edging gently in that direction with patient, unhurried deliberation. They were both cautious people who valued clarity and genuine connection over rushed decisions. "Morning," Patrick called cheerfully, emerging from the vehicle with a bakery box in one hand and an assortment of gardening tools in the other. "Ready to tackle those raised beds we've been planning?" They had discussed creating a vegetable garden on the sunny southern exposure of the property. Helen's first attempt at growing food rather than purely ornamental plants. Patrick, with his practical knowledge of mountain-growing conditions and gardening techniques, had offered to help design and construct the beds. "Absolutely," Helen replied, meeting him at the bottom of the deck stairs with genuine enthusiasm. "Though I have to admit I'm not entirely convinced I possess any natural talent for gardening." "Talent is vastly overrated in most pursuits," Patrick said, handing her the bakery box with a grin. "Persistence and consistent attention matter far more than innate ability. Plants respond to regular care and genuine interest, not to some mystical green thumb. Rather like relationships," Helen observed, accepting the pastries with appreciation. "Exactly like relationships," Patrick agreed, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she found increasingly appealing. They spent the morning measuring and constructing cedar frames that would hold Helen's first serious gardening experiment. The physical work was deeply satisfying in ways her previous life had rarely offered, creating something tangible, useful, potentially nourishing. Her hands got dirty, her back muscles stretched in unfamiliar ways, and she felt vibrantly alive and present in her body. "Your son Stephen called me yesterday," Patrick mentioned casually as they broke for lunch on the deck, the spring sunshine warm on their faces. Helen paused in surprise, setting down her sandwich. "Stephen called you? Whatever for?" "He wanted to know if I'd be here this weekend," Patrick explained with a slight smile. "Said he didn't want to interrupt or impose if we had plans together. Wanted to confirm your availability before making assumptions." The consideration implicit in Stephen's inquiry, checking first rather than presuming, respecting that she might have her own plans and relationships, warmed Helen unexpectedly. "What did you tell him?" "That he should talk to you directly about your availability and schedule," Patrick replied, "that I don't keep your calendar or speak for your commitments." "Wise answer," Helen approved. "He's trying, genuinely trying. They all are in their different ways." James nodded thoughtfully. "They are indeed, imperfectly and inconsistently at times, but with what seems like genuine effort. It's more progress than you expected 6 months ago, isn't it?" "Considerably more," Helen admitted, "making them see me as a complete person with agency and boundaries, rather than just a convenient mother figure to be accessed when needed. That's been transformative for all of us." Before Patrick could respond, Helen's phone rang. Stephen's name appeared on the screen, as if their conversation had somehow summoned him. "Mom," Stephen greeted her when she answered, his tone notably different from their conversation 6 months earlier. "Hope I'm not calling at a bad time." "Not at all," Helen replied warmly. "Patrick and I are just having lunch after working on garden beds. What's on your mind?" A brief pause, perhaps Stephen processing that she now had regular plans with people he didn't even know, a life independent of her children. "Actually, Victoria and I were hoping we could bring the kids up this weekend for a proper visit," he said carefully. "Tyler hasn't stopped talking about your mountain house for months. We thought, well, we'd like to spend some time with you if that works with your schedule." The careful phrasing, a genuine request rather than an assumption, acknowledgement that she might have other plans, represented meaningful change from their previous dynamic. "That would be lovely, Michael," Helen replied sincerely. "When were you thinking of arriving?" Saturday mid-morning, if that works for you, Stephen suggested. We were planning to get rooms at the lodge in town, of course, unless you specifically invite us to stay with you. Another significant difference from the holiday invasion: no presumption they would occupy her guest rooms without explicit invitation. The lodge is comfortable and convenient, Helen said, appreciating his careful approach. But you're genuinely welcome to use the guest rooms here if you prefer. Just let me know your decision so I can prepare accordingly. After finalizing details and ending the call, Helen looked up to find Patrick watching her with quiet approval and warmth. That sounded remarkably respectful and considerate, he observed. Quite a change from last December. It was, Helen agreed. Though I find myself still adjusting to this new version of Stephen, who actually asks permission and considers my schedule rather than simply informing me of his plans. Do you trust it will last? Patrick asked the question gently. That the changes are genuine and permanent rather than temporary? Helen considered carefully, measuring her words. I trust that the fundamental dynamic has shifted in important ways, she said slowly. Whether every interaction will perfectly reflect that shift, that's another question entirely. Old patterns and habits have tremendous power, but the baseline has definitely changed because I changed it first. I stopped accepting the role they had assigned me and demanded something different. Because you shifted your own position first, Patrick pointed out. You stopped waiting for them to include you and built a life that doesn't revolve around their attention or approval. Later that afternoon, after Patrick had departed with promises to return the next day to continue the garden project, Thomas called for their weekly check-in conversation that had continued faithfully since the holiday confrontation. Helen brought him up to date on the garden project and Stephen's upcoming visit, on Sophie's continued growth and their developing relationship. Sounds like steady progress continues across multiple fronts, Thomas noted approvingly. How are you feeling about all of it? About where things stand now? Helen looked around at her home, so thoroughly and completely hers in every detail. From the carefully selected art on the walls to the garden beds taking shape outside, from the well-stocked kitchen to the comfortable furniture chosen solely for her preferences. Content, she replied truthfully. Genuinely content for the first time in years. Not because everything is suddenly perfect with my children, it isn't and probably never will be. But because my happiness and sense of self-worth no longer depend entirely on their approval or inclusion. That's the real victory, Thomas observed wisely. Independence of spirit and identity, not just independent living situation. That evening, as twilight settled over the mountains in gradual purple shadows, Helen walked the perimeter of her property. She was mentally mapping possibilities, where flowering shrubs might attract butterflies and hummingbirds, where a meditation bench might capture the perfect morning light, where wind chimes would catch the afternoon breezes. Small additions and improvements to make this place even more distinctly hers. Her phone chimed with an incoming email from Sophie. The college essay was attached with a nervous message asking for Helen's honest assessment and feedback. Helen settled into her favorite reading chair by the window to read carefully. The essay was beautifully written and surprisingly mature, exploring how witnessing Helen's transformation had inspired Sophie's own reconsideration of identity and authentic self-expression. She wrote specifically about the holiday eve when she had stayed behind after the others went to the lodge, describing it as a pivotal turning point in her understanding of what it meant to live intentionally and authentically rather than according to others' limiting expectations. In watching my grandmother reclaim her identity beyond the restrictive roles assigned to her, Sophie had written, I began questioning which parts of my own identity were genuinely authentic and which were merely performances designed to secure approval from parents, peers, and society. Her courage in establishing firm boundaries, even when it created painful confrontations, showed me that genuine relationships must be built on mutual respect and honesty rather than obligation or fearful accommodation. Tears welled unexpectedly in Helen's eyes as she read her granddaughter's perceptive words. Of all the outcomes she had imagined when she first purchased this mountain sanctuary, peace, independence, self-discovery, she had never anticipated becoming a model of empowerment for her teenage granddaughter. The realization crystallized something Helen had been feeling increasingly over recent months. This home, initially acquired primarily as a reaction to exclusion and a statement of independence born from deep hurt, had evolved into something far more positive and generative. Not merely a retreat from painful relationships, but a solid foundation for building authentic new ones. Not an ending, but truly a beginning. Helen composed a thoughtful, detailed response to Sophie, praising both her writing craft and her insights, then stepped onto her deck to watch the first stars emerge in the darkening sky. The mountain air carried the scent of Earth awakening, of possibilities continuing to unfold. 5 months earlier, she had stood in this same spot, nursing fresh wounds of exclusion and preparing herself for difficult confrontation. Now she stood in quiet, genuine anticipation of her family's upcoming visit. Not desperate for their approval, not anxious about their judgment, but authentically looking forward to continuing their collective journey toward more honest connection. The mountain house had fulfilled its purpose, though not exactly as the dramatic statement of independence she had initially imagined. Instead, it had become the solid foundation for a life rebuilt entirely on her own terms. A life with ample room for family, for friendship, for continued growth and discovery. A life where being systematically forgotten for 6 consecutive holidays had led, through unexpected and painful pathways, to being truly seen and valued as a complete person for the first time in years. Helen smiled up at the emerging stars, feeling simultaneously grounded in this place and free to continue evolving. Like the mountains themselves, standing firm and enduring while also constantly changing with weather, season and time.